In this tutorial, I'm going to show you step by step how to secure your REST API using JWT, Json Web Token. And here I have an application with 3 endpoints, alt controller containing the token endpoint, as you can see. We also have the home controller containing the /home endpoint, and also have the person controller containing the /person's URL. For the first one, the alt controller, this is where you retrieve your access token. The home controller contains /home. Here, authentication is not required. And in the person controller, for you to access the list of persons, you need to be authenticated and you need to present your access token. So let's run this application and let's see how it works. So I'm going to Postman, and now let's try to access these different URLs. Let's see how JWT web tokens work. So I'm going to start a new request. So I'm going to use a HTTP request. I'm going to go to HTTP localhost at port 8080, and I'm going to home. And here you can see it says, hello user, nice to meet you. Now, if you look at the application, you can see that we have hello user, nice to meet you, but take note that we check if the user is authenticated first. If the user is authenticated, then the user is going to be the authentication.username. Okay, so let's go to the next one. The next endpoint is the person controller. So we are going to try to access /person. So if I go to access /persons, you see that we have 401 unauthorized right here. So you can actually take a look at the response. And also if you look at the result in a browser, you see that you're not able to access. For us to access this endpoint persons, we need to obtain the access token. And for us to obtain the access token, we need to go to /token endpoint. When we go to /token endpoint, we have to authenticate by presenting our username and our password, and then we get authenticated and then retrieve an access token. And for subsequent requests, we now need to present the access token. So right now, I'm going to go to the token endpoint, which is /token. Now, for us to access the token endpoint, we need to be authenticated. So we need to set it to basic authentication. In that case, it's going to ask us our username and our password. Now, I've set up a basic username and password for this basic authentication, in-memory username and password. And now, if I make a request to access token, now it's going to be a post request because we are sending the username and password, and we have to obtain the access token, as you can see. So it tells us 200 OK and gives us the access token. Now, for me to go to access the /person's URL to retrieve the list of persons, I need to present this access token. So right now, let's now go to /person's URL. And if I go to /person's URL, as you can see right here, and I make a request, it tells me unauthorized. So what I'm going to do is to present the access token, and let us see if it allows us. So I'm going to go to authorization and go to type and choose bearer token. And here I'm going to paste the access token. And at this point, if I make the request, you see that we have the list of items right here. So this is a workflow for securing your API with JSON Web Tokens. Now let's go into the step-by-step. I've made a tutorial here in my website, so you can see the step-by-step right here. There are 9 steps. There are 9 steps we are going to follow to implement JSON Web Tokens to secure our REST API. So let's go ahead to get started with part 1. And in part 1, we are going to create a basic REST API application. Okay, so in this first part, let's build a simple REST API. Of course, if you have an existing REST API application, you can use it. But for now, let's just build a REST API from the scratch. And I'm going to go to Spring Initializer. And in Spring Initializer, I'm going to just use a group name com.kindson, the genius. Now I'm going to leave it at 3.32, and I'm going to call it JWT beginner tutorial, and I'm going to give it a name. And we have a number of dependencies we are going to add. So if you look at the step-by-step, it says we are going to add 3 dependencies. The first one is Spring Boot Starter Alt 2. Spring Boot Starter Alt 2 ResourceServer, Spring Boot Starter Web, and Spring Boot Configuration Processor. So let's add our dependencies. So we have web, It's going to be this one, and the second one is configuration processor, and the last one will be ResourceServer. And finally, I would like us to add the Lombok annotation because I would like to create a simple list of users or list of items. Okay, so everything is okay, Java 17. I'm going to generate. And then I'm going to open this application in IntelliJ after unzipping it. So I've opened the JWT beginner tutorial in IntelliJ. I would like to place this side by side with the step-by-step tutorial I'm going to be following. So I'm going to just place this side by side with this one. Okay, so let me just make some room here. Okay, so these are the steps we are going to be following. So the first step says create and configure. Sorry, the first step, this is where we are. Okay, so I would like us to create a number of things. So I would like us to create the controller endpoint for home and also persons. So I'm going to create a new package. I'm going to call it controller. And here I'm going to create two classes. So I'm going to call it person controller. And I'm going to create a second one, and I'm going to call it home controller. So I'm going to annotate the home controller with at rest controller annotation. And here we are going to write the function to return hello user. So I'm going to say get mapping to /home, and it's going to be public string is going to be home, and it's going to return. First, we are going to try to see if the user is authenticated, and we are going to return it. So I'm going to say string user is equal to, so this is going to take authentication. So if the user is, if there is an authenticated user, so I'm going to say authentication. If it's not equal to null, then we are going to return authentication.getName. That's if it's not null. Else we are going to return user. Okay, so I'm going to return hello plus user. Nice to meet you. Okay, so if we test this endpoint, we are going to have it working. So I'm going to test it right now. So I'm going to click on this button to run this application right now. All right, so it starts on port 8080. So I'm going to access in my browser, http localhost port 8080/home. And let's see what we have. Oh, so we can't get in for now. So sorry, I didn't explain this. So for now, we can't get in because we've not configured authentication. So sorry about this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead to create the second endpoint. That's the person's controller. So here I'm going to write the function return persons. Before I do that, I'll need to create a model that holds the person's class. So I'm going to create a new package here. I'm going to call it model. And inside this package, I'm going to just create a person object. So I'm going person, and person is going to have an all acts constructor, a data annotation. So I have my getters and the setters. I think I'll just copy this from where I have it and just paste it instead of going through this. Okay, so these are the fields of the person class. And in the person controller, I want to return a list of persons. So I'm going to say we return a list of person. Get persons, and we are going to just return. So I'm going to create an array list of persons and then return it. So I have it already, so I'm going to just copy it and paste. So I have a list of 5 random persons I want to return. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are just random names. I'm going to just return people, okay, which is actually the list of persons. So this is our API is ready now. So while we have we're having the screen to enter our username and password is because we have the Spring Security already. So if you look at our pom.xml, we have the Spring Security right there. Our ResourceServer adds the Spring Security. So just to test, I'm going to temporarily remove this Spring Security, and then I'm going to test this application, and let's just make sure that our endpoint works as expected. So I'm going to run this application right now. So I'm going to just remove this temporarily, and later I'm going to get it back. Our application starts on port 8080. So if we try to access HTTP localhost, and I go to home, we have hello user, nice to meet you, and let's try to access persons, and we also have the list of persons exactly as we wanted it. So this is how the API is set up. So let's go back to continue from where we stopped. So I'm going to go back to my pump.xml and I'm going to just remove this and go back to actually the home controller, reload the packages, and we should have no errors. The home controller, we should not have any error at this point. So we should have authentication. Okay, so we have our API ready, and let's now go to the next step. In the next step, we are now going to create and configure the security filter chain. So let's go continue in the next part. Okay, now we are going to create and configure the security filter chain bean. So this is basically what is corresponding to when you extend the web security configurer adapter. But right now, this web security configurer adapter is deprecated, and we are not going to be using it in this tutorial. We are going to be using the current methods of configuring the security filter chain, and we are going to be using symmetric keys for this tutorial for creating our web token. So first, we are going to take the step one, create the security configuration file in the config directory, actually in the config package. So I'm going to first create the config package. So I'm going to call it config, all right? And here I'm going to create the security config class. So previously we have this class will extend web security configurer adapter, but now it's no longer going to be doing that. So I'm going to annotate with that configuration to say that there is a configuration class, and I'm going to also annotate with enable web security. Okay, so we are going to create the security filter chain bean, and this security filter chain bean is going to return a configured HTTP security filter chain, and it's going to take HTTP security. So these methods will be used to configure the HTTP security as we used to do before. And of course, we are going to return HTTP security.build. We're going to build it, but we are going to do a bit of configuration before we build. And of course, it throws an exception. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to disable CRF. So I'm going to say CSRF.disable. Now it's going to ask me to use a Lambda method. So this is fine, okay? So the next thing is I want to authorize the home route to be accessible without authentication. So I'm going to say that authorize HTTP request. I'm going to use this as the parameter. So that request matches to /home, and I'm going to say that permit all. Okay, so the next one, any other request that is coming has to be authenticated. So here we are saying that for the home route, we don't need any authentication. Okay, so we want to also use a stateless session to make this server to be stateless. So I'm going to say .session management, and I'm going to say section .create. So the creation policy is going to be stateless. And then we need basic authentication. So .http basic authentication, I'm going to just use the default, customizer.with default. Okay, so this is what we have. You can actually copy and paste. You also have this code on my GitHub repository. You can also take it from there. Okay, so this is the filter chain bean, more or less the same configuration we normally do using when we override the HTTP, when we override the configuration methods of the configurer adapter. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create a test user. So I don't want to go into databases or storing my user in the database. So I want to simply create a bean that returns me a single user. So it's going to be public in memory user details manager. And here I want to return a single user. So I'm going to return new in memory user details manager, and I'm going to say user.with username, and I'm going to use kindson and the password. And I'm going to use a password encoder of no op password encoder. So to specify the password encoder, I simply say no op. So and then specify the password. So in this case, I'm using a no op password encoder. I also need authorities. So I'm just going to maybe read or write or whatever. So this is not important because we are not going to be working with authorities in this tutorial. In the subsequent tutorials, we are going to be covering a few more details. So we have this returning, this bin here returning just one single user. Okay, so the next one is to configure the auth2 resource server. Now, what is the auth2 resource server? In Spring, this is a server that protects resources and ensures that requests are authenticated using access tokens typically issued by an auth2 authorization server. So in this case, we are saying that this application is going to be a resource server that holds resources that has to be authenticated using web tokens before they are accessed. We tell Spring that our service is an auth2 resource server. So to do that, we are simply going to add, just before the session management, we are going to say that auth2 resource resource server, and I'm going to say auth2 resource server. I'm going to say auth2, and it's going to be auth2.jwt and say customizer.with defaults. All right. Okay, so this makes it that our application now is a resource server and requires JWT to access the resources defined in this application. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead to run this application and let's see what we have. So I'm going to run this. Now I expect it to give us an error message that says we need a decoder, right? And this is important because we need an encoder and decoder to be able to manage the JWT or Json Web Token. So it says that consider defining a bin of type JWT decoder in your configuration. Parameter 0 of the filter chain requires a decoder, as you can see. Okay, so how do we create a decoder? To create a decoder, we will need keys, a public and a private key. For us to use, we are going to be using asymmetric keys. So this is what we are going to perform deciphering of the token. So I'm going to create a public and a private key. So I'm going to create these keys manually and place it in my application. And later I'm going to move them into a configuration file. Like you can store them as environment variables, but now I'm going to simply create these keys. So the first thing I'm going to create is in my resource folder. I want to put these keys inside the sats folder. So I'm going to create a folder called sats in my resource. Now there are commands in Mac that you can use to generate keys. So I'm going to simply run those commands. So if I go to my terminal, if you're on Windows, please check in the description of this video to see how you can actually generate these keys using OpenSSL. I think you can have this OpenSSL for Windows as well. So check the description. I'm going to update the description to include how to do it. So I'm going to simply take this, and also I'm going to navigate inside this folder. So I'm going to say open in terminal, and I'm going to simply clear my console, and I'm going to paste this command. Once I run it, you see in the sat folder, I generate a key pair.pem. Now I'm going to generate a private key as well by running this command, and I'm going to paste it right here, and it generates a public key. So there are two of them. Okay, so we are going to generate the private key from the key pair. So I'm going to run this command. So this command generates us a private key. So if you go back, you see we have a private key. So I'm going to delete the key pair at this time. So this is basically how you generate your asymmetric keys, your public and the private keys. Now I want to externalize the configuration for these keys so that we can have access to these keys using configuration instead of having to read these files manually. So to do that, I'm going to create a file. I'm going to call it RSA key properties inside the config directory. I'm going to create RSA key properties, and this is actually going to be a record type because it will be holding our configuration. So insert this. Okay, so here I'm going to annotate with configuration, and I'm going to actually add configuration properties, and I'm going to specify the prefix to be RSA. So the configuration properties for the properties files will be prefixed with RSA. And the parameters will be RSA, we take the public key first, public key, and RSA private key and private key. Okay, so this is all we have to do for the configuration, and I'm going to now specify these two items in the properties file. So I have this configuration defined in the properties files, and they're also accessible via configuration using the RSA key properties. Then we want to annotate the main class with @enable configuration properties. So I'm going to go to the main class, which is this class, and I'm going to say @enable. So sorry, I'm not explaining everything as I go. You can read my website, or you can watch the extended video where I have the playlist, have all the detailed explanations of all the concepts. For now, I just want to do a walkthrough so that you'll be able to set this up quickly in your application. So I'm going to say RSA key properties.class. Okay, so we've externalized the keys, the configuration for the keys. Now let's go to proceed to complete creating our decoders. So let's go back to our security config. Step 7, complete the creation of the JWT decoder and the encoder. Okay, so I'm going to inject the properties into this class because I'm going to be using them. So I'm going to say private RSA key properties, and I'm going to do a constructor injection, the final here, and now it's going to force us to do a constructor injection right here. Okay, so we now want to define a decoder. So decoder should be a bin. So JWT decoder, and it's going to return. So we have a class called Nimbus coming from the Auth2 server that we added as dependency. So it gives us a decoder that creates a decoder using the public key that we have. So it's going to be properties that's public key, and I think we have to build it. Build. Okay, so let's just check to make sure we are not missing out anything. So we have the build. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to create our encoder. So I'm going to say bin, and this time we are going to create our encoder, JwtEncoder. In this case, there are a number of things I cannot explain completely, but we need JWK. So the Nimbus JWT encoder requires a JWK source, and a JWK source requires you to build using the keys. In this case, we are going to build it using the public and the private keys. So I'm going to say new RSA key dot builder, and we are going to specify RSA key properties of public key dot private key is going to be RSA key dot private key, and finally I'm going to say dot build. Okay. So if you miss out anything, please take a look at the codes right here, okay? Okay, so now we have the JWK, and then we are going to create the source, the JWK source. So I'm going to create a new JWK source, JWK, and this is going to be taking view of type security context, context. And JWK source is equal to new immutable JWK set. We are going to create a new JWK set and give it the JWK. Now we have a JWK source, and we are going to now use it for creating the encoder. So I'm going to now return new Nimbus JWT encoder JWK source. Okay. All right. So we have our encoder and our decoder for this for our keys. Okay. Step 8. So the next thing we want to do is let's create the service that returns the token. So I'm going to create a class. First, I'm going to create a package. I'm going to call it service, and inside the service, I'm going to create the token service class. Token service, and this is going to be service annotation, and this class is going to create the JWT token. Now I'm going to copy and paste this code for interest of time, and then I'm going to explain it to you. So I'm pasting this code and I'm going to just do the imports. Okay, so we have the generate token method. So generate token takes the current time. It gets the scope by getting the authorities and then separating the authorities by space. So it's a read, write, and all those other things, permissions. And then it creates a claim set by using the builder pattern. The issuer is self. We are self-issuing the certificate. The issue time is now expired after 1 hour chrono unit, that hours 1. Claim scope is the scope which we already have from here. And then we build. And then we are going to encode these the JWT encoder parameters from the claim set and get the token value from it. So this is how we generate our access token, right? So we generate our access token. Now we are going to go to the last part. We are going to write a method that returns this access token, but after a user have been authenticated. So I'm going to now go to create the last controller class. So I'm going to call it new Java class, alt controller, and this is going to for sure be at rest controller. And we are going to have, I'm going to actually just copy and paste this for the interest of time. So this actually takes, so we need to use a logger because I would like to log some things. Logger is equal to logger factory.getLogger, and it's going to be alt controller.class. Okay, so I'm going to, second is going to be called, I'm going to inject the token service. So I'm going to say private final token service, and I'm going to do a constructor injection at the constructor parameter. And at this point, we are done, right? We are done with this application. So at this point, /token retrieve the access token, but we have to authenticate with username and password and retrieve the access token. And then with the access token, we can now access the person controller. This is /persons, and let's just check home at home. Okay, so this is basically it. This is how to set up JWT, Json Web Token, and use it to secure your REST API step by step. Let's try it and just see that everything works before we continue. Interface record expected, where I think I need to have this duplicated. So let's run this application and let's see what we have. So if everything goes well, our application starts without any error. That would be great. And perfect, our application starts with no errors. That is fine. And we are going to go to, first let's just go to home. So let's stay here and let's go to home. So this is where we are. If I refresh, we are not having anything. And let's go to home. And we have hello user, nice to meet you, because we are not authenticated. Now, if we now go to Postman, let's go to Postman, and of course this doesn't work. So let's go to home, send. So it's home. Sorry, I need to set this to no alt. So send. So we have hello user, nice to meet you. Let's now go to the access token and retrieve the access token. So I'm going to, of course, if you go to persons, we have unauthorized 401. Okay. So let's go to access token. I'm going to do a post to /token, and I'm going to the, it's going to be a post /token, and we are going to use a basic authentication because we require a basic authentication to be able to. So here, this is the basic authentication, username and password to be authenticated. And if I send, we have an access token. So I'm going to copy it. By the way, if you now go to /home, it's going to give us the name, hello, the name of the person who logged in. So let's go to get here, and you can say, hello, kind son, nice to meet you, because it's recognized that you are now authenticated. Now let's go to /person, and to access /person, we are going to provide a bearer token. And of course, it seems this is it, but I'm going to just paste it right there and send. So at this point, we have the person's URL returned the data we wanted, as you can see. So this is basically how to secure your REST API using Json Web Token. There are a number of other considerations. For instance, how do we load up the authentication details from the database? And also, how do we implement authorization server? You may also have some other questions related to JWT you might like to clarify. Please leave that in the comment box so that in the next video, I'm going to take this into consideration. I'd like to thank you for viewing. If this has been informative, please subscribe to my channel, leave me a comment, like this video by clicking on that like button below. Also activate notification so that you don't miss any update from me. The link to the step-by-step tutorial I used for this tutorial is right there in the description box or in my website, kindsonthegenius.com. You can find a link to this. And please, let's keep in touch. So we'll see you in the next part. I remain Kindson the Tech Pro, and we'll see you again later.